Okay, everybody. Well, we are about to go dark with video, actually, this time. So hello to all the smiling faces of anyone watching this. And let's add Erik to the call. We had some pretty epic technical issues last time. So Erik and I consulted the I Ching today, and the I Ching unequivocally advised us to go audio only due to the lag and glitch issues we were having with yesterday's aborted conversation. So this is largely a call about the weird interzones of the spiritual realm and electronic society. So it's kind of appropriate for us to have all these issues. Erik, are you on the call there? Yet, sir? Get on there. So for anyone who's just joining us, this is a chat about the reissued Technosis, Myth, Magic, and Mysticism in the Age of Information, which is being released again by North Atlantic Books this year. And it's a rare and precious volume in a society that loves to discuss technology, but seems largely oblivious to how our age is actually continuous with the ages of the past, in that we use technology to project our religious impulses and to concretize them into something. You know, it's where our yearn to transcend and our yearning to control meet in the physical world. So Erik, are you with us now?
I am indeed with you, sir.
Excellent. Well, I've already informed the audience that the I Ching advised us not to go with video today. So thanks for joining us. And
Absolutely, and I apologize for our developing world level of internet connectivity here in San Francisco. That's right, folks. You heard it right. San Francisco. I live in the city of San Francisco, the absolute white heart center of the technological creative mutation, and yet my internet's kind of crappy.
well, there was San Francisco was where Skynet was headquartered in the last Terminator film. So it may just be that your home is becoming ever more inimical to human existence.
But we have the Federation too, and in a way, those are the two models, right? On the one hand, you have the Federation from Star Trek, where it's a liberal UN kind of globalist model. We're no longer fighting nation states. We're still human beings. We have desires. We get to drink tea and we explore the universe. That sounds pretty cool from a humanist point of view. And yet, on the other side, we have Skynet, which is, of course, a whole other ball of wax. And in a way, isn't that it? Isn't it the struggle between the Federation and Skynet?
Well, it's funny because most of what I wanted to talk to you about today was about how your book, which is really a brilliant piece of writing, has aged since 1998, and how you've written the new volume includes an afterword from the 2004 edition as well as a new afterword from the 2015 edition. And one of the things that you discuss is the way that this expectation that we had of boundary dissolution and transcendence at the turn of the millennium has become more complex, and now it's more of a general shifting and metamorphosis of the construction of new boundaries. And so, like in the most recent Star Trek films and the most recent Terminator films, we now have good Terminators that believe that they're people and are willing to donate their heart to dying members of the human resistance, like the actual human heart that these Terminators possess in order to spoof human security systems. And then the latest Star Trek film, the threat comes from within the Federation, from like a black box military program that, so it really is sort of a, our culture seems to be getting more and more comfortable with these liminal zones and these ethical complexities, and the just the less naive with respect to that sort of simple dyadic distinction.
Sure. And if you look at our popular culture, I mean, that was one of the things about even in 2004 when the edition came out, because since the book came out in '98, the Matrix films had hit. And for me, because I talk a lot about Gnosticism in the book, and I talk about how these ancient Christian heresies about the spark in us that can escape from this prison that's run by evil demons who are fabricating reality, that ancient model of mysticism and theology, it just fits like a hand in glove in our digital era. And then the Matrix films come along, and I was like, oh my God, so beautiful. It was just like a perfect expression, and I wrote about that. And I think even more now that a lot of the topics that I wrote about are even more available and perceivable through popular culture, because popular culture has gotten weirder, more full of occultism, more intense, and even as in some ways it's become more ordinary. Like in my lifetime, a lot of these sort of topics were very free in the 80s or even in the 90s, in the sense that you had to kind of dig for occultism, for Satanism, for people who believed that they were channeling deities. All this kind of stuff was around, or a subculture or an outside culture. And increasingly it's just a world, whether we believe it or not. It doesn't, in a way, it doesn't matter. It's not about that more people necessarily believe in these things. It's just that they're more available because of the way that popular culture introduces these ideas. We become fans of shows. The fantasy and science fiction have become the norm. These genres that were once kind of like, it was like geeks like this stuff, but geeks weren't mainstream. They weren't hip. And now it's just been this total cultural revolution, so that everybody of, and then if you talk about the popularity of yoga, and you talk about the way in which ideas of consciousness are entering into ordinary people's lives, it's really a lot of these kind of previously underground streams, or people call them, occult with a "chur" at the end. Cultural trends are and it's one of the reasons the book still resonates, is because it's full of the recent past and the older past that still have relevance today, because they remind us of where these esotericism and technology come from.
Yeah, definitely. There was, I'm sure you remember a couple of years ago when James Cameron's Avatar came out, and the Avatar world was something that sort of immediately took off within the LARPing community. And so you started having this new sort of this foreshadowing of a new dysphenia, like a psychological disorder with the possible fragmentation of world spaces that we seem kind of like doomed to experience with the advent of the true like landing of virtual reality, where these people were just morose and desperate because they became so immersed in the Pandora world that they couldn't like readjust to their life as human beings. And so it's sort of akin to that was sort of like my generation's wave of acid burnouts, maybe. That's like we, as we invest more and more of ourselves into this increasingly popular and available and sexy, because it's not just animated by our religious impulse, but it's actively being advertised and commercialized and sold to us. That we're really being encouraged to throw ourselves into these alternative world spaces. And then, there really isn't a landing pad for when we get back. So I feel like one of the lasting lessons of your book, and one of the reasons that I feel its resonance remains, is that it's useful for the perspective that allows a person to integrate those experiences, and functions in a way as sort of a manual for understanding our drives and the larger emotional matrix within which we are playing with all of these these new freedoms to explore occult realities.
No, that's very well said, actually, because in conventional society, more even very recently, these things have largely been shuttered out. I mean, they were part of the counterculture. For my generation, growing up in the shadow of the hippies, those things were around, but they were very much part of the counterculture. They were either mocked or ignored. But in the New York Times reality, which is sort of still kind of a good symbol for that fragmenting, consensus reality. I'm not sure if we have one anymore, or if it's not some crazy topological knot. But in the old days, it had a little bit more stability to it, and you would never see these things acknowledged, or if you were, they were pathologized. It was crazy. It was absurd. It was narcissistic, navel-gazing, and then the whole range of things: meditation, esotericism, UFOs, psychedelics, the whole range of extraordinary experience that people wanted to seek, and including the other world. So, Star Trek fans were just mocked, and it's just a silly kind of thing. And where I'm coming from in my life, a lot of it is someone who basically keeps my feet on the ground. I'm largely skeptical in temperament. I'm very anthropological in my approach, which means I like to go into environments and participate as I observe. That classic idea of participant observation. And what's come from that is a realization that you can plunge very deeply into very interesting, rich other worlds that are full of magic and enchantment and bizarre synchronicities and wonderful downloads. But at the same time, you can also trust a sort of ability to return to the body, to the ordinary, to the conditions of human experience in a sort of everyday way, and those don't have to be in conflict so much. You don't have to look at one as being something to avoid because it's going to make you crazy, or you're going to become irrational, you're not going to be able to live your life. That's not true. And at the same time, I think that these experiences are not only really valuable, but they're absolutely necessary to understand what's actually happening, because whether people acknowledge it or not, a lot of the times we are driven by these desires to be in dream worlds, to achieve unusual states of consciousness. Those narratives that and acknowledge them inside ourselves and see the way that they're driving us in many ways, I think we're even more clueless. And so in that sense, I differ very much from a lot of the, not just the new atheists, but just the sort of, there's a much stronger kind of rationalist, technologized way of thinking about experience and the mind that's very pervasive now, that's actually kind of almost carried like a sort of philosophical virus through the notion of tweaking and controlling your experience. And so for me, it's really important to keep portals open to the unknown, to the mystery, to the bizarre, because it's precisely in those encounters that we see beyond the sort of rationalistic frame, which often is, in my opinion, benighted than a more open-ended, not mystical, but sort of openness to the whole range of otherworldly experiences.
I just got a tweet, speaking of glitches and weirdness, and your line from the latest afterwards saying that the glitches represent the flip side of another order of being leaking through. I got a tweet from one of our audience just now saying, "It's not playing for me." I get a message saying the live video broadcast will begin soon. But you know, it shows on my end that the broadcast is happening. And so how is that for a breakdown of consensus reality? You know,
I don't know what to say. I've often in my experience been you know, tickled by these glitch demons, and so I'm not surprised entirely. I would like to think that it's mostly just you know, that the vagaries of the, you know, the Google technology and us deciding not to go to visual, but I'm assuming that some people are being able to tune into this as we speak.
Yeah, well, hopefully. Otherwise, it's being recorded, and they can tune in later, and then we get the private conversation without the audience that might hopefully make this somewhat more authentic. So, you know, for the sake of whoever in posterity ends up listening to this, I'm just going to continue assuming that we have an audience. You know, for me, just, you know, where my head is, and I guess it's, you know, you know, it's symptomatic of my being you know, sort of a child of this age. Most of my real life experience is referenced to works of science fiction, and I think I found as sort of a rhetorical device. There's a book by Stephen Baxter and Arthur C. Clarke. I think it might have been the last book that Clarke wrote, called The Light of Other Days, where the scientists invent a wormhole technology that allows them to see but not travel into any other place in the universe and any other time in the past. And so, you know, from that moment forward that that the future is watching you. And so it shifts the way it really ruptures the society and dramatically reshapes it, so that they become aware of, you know, sensitive to, not able to directly perceive, but nonetheless, you know, affected by the invisible watchers that they know are the historians of the future that are like constantly present at every moment, you know, from that point forward. And I feel like that, you know, that's something our mutual friend, the Tea Fairy, has spoken about. And, you know, just the way that social media has reshaped our relationship to the spirit world, and our relationship to, you know, has changed the metaphors that we think of it, in terms of it being a kind of a reality TV show where we're getting pinged by our post-singularity, you know, vile offspring, or that kind of thing. So, as a device, you know, go for it.
The way a slightly different version of it that I have that is actually helped by is well, I often wonder, like I think a lot of people, I struggle with like why I'm doing what I'm doing the way I'm doing it, and particularly being this weird kind of intellectual where I don't really have an institution. I'm not really involved in the academy. I was once part of a kind of vital world of popular magazine writing and cultural criticism that I was able to live off of as a young man, and that whole ecology is kind of gone. And so it's a very liminal kind of existence as I continue to be motivated by the things that I'm motivated by, and to make ethical decisions about how to promote or how to represent myself in this kind of vast, cacophonous, you know, mall reality that in many ways social media has become. And so I'm often kind of wondering like what it is that I'm doing, or even why I'm doing it. Why am I taking time to write to try to clarify some very complicated idea or whatever I'm doing? And I sometimes get the very visceral sense, not so much of my own post-singular self, but of the kind of wise and impassive robots of the future who are just processing through all of this material, so that at some point you can imagine there's this tremendous archive of material that we're being produced, and it's like that we are producing, and that at some point it's like there's going to be artificial intelligence unleashed on that stuff, just to sort of make sense of it, just to try to understand, and only through understanding will it be able to extract value, whatever value means for these robot historians of the future. And so I sometimes kind of feel like what I'm doing is just, in a way, using that readership to kind of up the standards, to make me look outside of my personal narcissistic need for ego, or to feel like I'm a cool guy, or to feel like I'm doing the right thing, or that somehow this is going to lead towards some kind of magnificent life of something, and that those sort of become a little bit less pressing when you look at it with a longer view. And so in some ways I think that having that post-singularity view serves to encourage us to manifest our deeper potential for ethical, creative, upright attitudes, because it's sort of hard to do in a lot of ways as we grasp for the self as it floats through these networks that are enlivened by capital and the apocalyptic anxiety of our civilization. And so sometimes that sense of a future watching, of a kind of the sort of way, like the way the angels are in Wim Wenders' film, the Wings of Desire. It's a beautiful film, highly recommend it. And in here, the angels just sort of witness, and they're around people, and they're suffering, and they're loving, and they're reading, and it's a beautiful presentation, because it's like you don't get out of ordinary life, you don't get out of the struggles, and yet there is this sort of this watcher that's partly you, and partly the singularity, and partly God, and partly the future, that sort of witnesses and contains in some ways the particulars of the experience. And I find that to be a very good attitude, because we're plunging into this radical reality creation situation where we have to keep the positive visions going alongside the terrible fears, paranoias, apocalyptic presentiments, despair, all the stuff that comes along with a global civilization spinning out of control.
Definitely. There's a through line here to one of the last chapters of someone I know that has inspired us both immensely, William Irwin Thompson. His book, Coming into Being, Artifacts and Texts in the Evolution of Consciousness, has a chapter on the Ramayana, and how the Ramayana tells about how the humans and animals allied to expel the demons from what we now take as like mundane everyday reality. But that Bill Thompson's view was that the electrical imaginary descending back into our networked global civilization is opening a portal, that the screen is literally a sort of shamanic window through which these spirits are granted a fresh access to our world. And then in your latest afterword, you talk about how the irony of this these ultra hyper realist, skeptic, atheist, revenge of the Enlightenment types, is that you can't actually create a complete model of the mundane world. You can't actually perfectly map the perfectly enlightened cosmos without getting into all of the weird stuff, all of the out-of-body experiences and the UFO abductions. These things have to be explained in order to, cast out all of the shadows. But of course, the sort of naive attempt to cast them out is really just an invocation, So we get into this thing that is very much like the topological knot that you mentioned earlier, where merely by addressing them, they've become a more and more vivid part of our reality. So it's
Absolutely. No, and I think that that's part of the deeper logic behind the Renaissance and psychedelics. I think on the surface, the Renaissance and psychedelics, which is of course extremely important for all of this discussion, because psychedelics introduce you into an other world that is sort of like this one, but has a lot of characteristics that look a lot like the occult or religion or mysticism, even if it's not exactly the occult or religion or mysticism. In many ways, psychedelics is is a key site in understanding how modern technological scientific people recover, rediscover, and sort of repackage, if you will, these kinds of liminal states, otherworldly encounters, potential sources of meaning, potential sort of spiritual experiences. And so I think that one of the reasons that we have seen such an incredible renaissance so quickly is because it was an inevitable part of scientific logic. Science has to take the brain seriously. It has to take the experiences in the brain seriously. Psychedelics are clearly physical, material, phenomenological agents that produce somewhat regular effects. We have to understand that if we're going to understand the brain. Any reasonable scientist is going to say that. And, whoa, lo and behold, it actually seems to do some good. And so it's like the genie is out of the bottle. And the genie doesn't mean that we're going to return to some kind of mystical worldview. I don't believe we are. I think we're in a state of tremendous mixing, of a multidimensional view where we have to learn how to move between different kinds of frameworks, including occult frameworks, including mystical or religious frameworks, but also including secular, critical, analytic, scientific in that classic sense frameworks as well. And how to do that, I don't know, but I do know that it's a multidimensional field, and I think that that's why we see this turn towards psychedelics.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that is, and in the sense of the original articulation of Technosis, you got that chapter, "The Path is a Network," and there's something about the way that the network allows for this manifold, multifaceted appraisal of reality, that it really breeds and encourages and nourishes that kind of multi-perspectivism. And so in a way, I think the inherently psychedelic nature of our age, and what's become really just like much more imminently and vividly obvious and easy to spot by the mainstream culture in general, is that we don't all agree. I mean, it's a much deeper revelation of the same kind of cultural relativism that we started to experience, through the global interchange and commerce a couple hundred years ago. But now it's to the point where it's not, the culture has splintered to such an extraordinary degree due to the fact that everyone at the dinner table is occupying their own iPhone reality portal. It's the main yoga of at least this first half of the 20th century seems to be the psychedelic yoga of being able to take our ontological conclusions lightly and to be able to juggle them and to adopt them when they're appropriate, but to treat them with the kind of middle way balance of skepticism and sympathy that you have modeled for your readers.
Yeah, that's a really important thing. Also, it plays an important role in a lot of the stuff that we haven't been talking about, which is the sort of dark side of the tale. And probably my proudest thing about the Technosis, the first, when it came out in 1998, is you got to remember, the book was written during the first internet bubble. I mean, this was a time when a truly millennialist set of ideas was by many people working in technology, that the rules of the economy were moving around abundance, that it's that kind of utopian thinking, which was partly legitimately believed. And I knew a lot of these people. I was kind of part of that world of people who were imagining the potential of virtual reality, of new kinds of political formations, new kinds artistic people to draw together in community. And at the same time, those ideas were also ruthlessly exploited by capital, essentially a kind of Ponzi scheme of IPOs. And so the sense that something new and different was happening was also simultaneously exploited. And at the time when I was writing Technosis, it would have been easy, I think, for maybe someone else who was trying to do what I was doing to write a much more happy, fluffy vision. Oh, here we are, just around the corner, just about to break through. But for me, that sense of transformation was always accompanied by a kind of there's a shadow in the other world. If you open the portal and you accept the existence of these half fantastic beings, there are demons there as well. And in our visions, there's apocalyptic energies. There's the sense of mass breakdown, the proximity of all these different kinds of visions, whether they're ecological collapse or the rise of a fascist surveillance state using all the information on us. Just the sheer world of absolutely woven into every part. At some level, we know intimately that every time we're using a device, we're sort of moving through a shadow realm where we don't know what sorts of agents, entities, algorithms, human beings are perceiving and making meaning out of our operations. That is an unnerving situation, and it's one that we have to live with, and we have to live with in a way we neither, in my opinion, discount it the way that some people seem to be sort of okay with the surveillance state on some level, or it doesn't really bother them. I don't really understand that point of view, but I recognize that. On the other hand, it's also extremely paranoid in a variety of deeply suspicious or giving up a sort of hope that communication carries any meaning. To my mind, we have to acknowledge that we do have these fears and terrors and apocalyptic presumptions inside of us, inside our imaginations, inside our hearts, inside our stories, inside our cultural traditions. And so we have to be very careful about where we mix, as it were, the sort of apocalyptic templates that we carry in our imaginations with the actual real conditions that we find ourselves in. And it's very tricky, but it's taking that same sort of balance of skepticism and sympathy into the shadow realm as well as into the utopian realm. And then in a lot of ways I feel that's where we're at, and that's part of what I do, is to kind of try to map that ginger, open but questioning space, because it seems like one of the places to try to navigate these very difficult issues.
I mean, yeah, there's the thing that gets me about it is that so many people still sort of worship this idea of the return to nature, or in the Terence McKenna sense of an archaic revival, this sort of forward escape atavism where we go all the way around and end up back where we've started, transformed. But the thing to understand about that we're also naive to the lived reality of not being on the top of the food chain, and that's absolutely part of this that comes back. It can't be divorced from the rest of it. That we long for the community of the tribal life that we left behind, for the openness, the permeability of the self that we experience. The last experiment of civilization was profoundly dissociative and isolated and lonely, and as a consequence, we have this totally pathological relationship to the natural world. But in restoring that, the humility that we mentioned sort of towards the end of the call yesterday, the humility of science recognizing its ultimate ignorance, and the humility of our own sort of savvy relationship to technoculture is that we really are moving into, back into an age where we're no longer able to kid ourselves quite so successfully about the dragons that we have sort of swept under the map. They're still there, and they're in a way even more alive for us now. I mean, I don't know, maybe that's not fair, but I mean, you did say in your interview with Vice magazine that a god is just a fiction that everyone believes in. So in a way, and this is sort of information warfare 101, even if the NSA did not have supercomputers inside that Utah data complex, the fact that they built it and that it can be observed on Google Maps holds this profound power over the human imagination. And so, we're all having to catch up really quickly to to these magical concepts, even if they're not clothed in that kind of that language and the trappings of magical traditions. We're being reacquainted with the power of the symbol and the power of ritual and the sway that an idea has over the population when it becomes harder and harder to verify things beyond the shadow of a doubt.
For sure. I mean, that's one of the things that, let's just call it conspiracy thinking and not define it, because it gets defined in all sorts of ways, some of which I think are themselves forms of mind gaming. But we're in a realm of mind games. We're in a realm where perception is reality, where the crafting of perception is working on multiple levels through multiple agendas. Multiple agents are crafting reality in a more and more overt way, even as we're technically being able to craft reality in an experiential sense more and more. So with now we're getting into the edge of virtual reality 2.0, and it's really going to be a wide. I think that, again, familiarity with these sort of liminal zones, whether it's approached through the understanding of altered states and trance in a kind of psychological way, an anthropological way, in terms of how cultures begin to tell a story and begin to impact their life, like up into these, but if done believe or find a new answer or find a new secret, but discoveries with like minds, organizations, expressing it through culture, that's actually one of the ways we can navigate through the jungle that we're in, because it seems to me, from where I sit, that I can understand why people want to drop out, like fully drop out, whether they drop out into criminal underworlds of the dark net or whether they get offline and try to, like, that extreme desire makes a lot of sense to me. It's not who I am. It's not where I am. So as long as I'm still participating in this world that we're sharing, that we're fabricating, the machines are fabricating, we're sharing with machines, we have to develop that kind of light step, and also a willingness. You mentioned this is on a slightly different topic. You mentioned the sense of the larger ecological framework that we're in, and that's also increasingly for me a truth, which is that as we look at what's happening with technology, as we try to understand what's happening with communication and human civilization, it's impossible to extricate it from this larger ecological condition. And so it really feels like what we're being asked today, what we're called on kind of ethically or imaginatively, is to extend our ability to sympathize, to connect with, and even just to leave a space open for that which is outside of us, outside of the human frame, outside of the human story, whether that's technology and algorithmic intelligence and what that's about, as well as the institutions and forms that are constructing these things, as well as ultimately a more ecological and even cosmic view, where we're on a planet, the planet's going through a lot, we're in space, that all of those larger views, I think, are partly what we're called upon to connect with. And I think one of my my greater fears or concerns with our moment, I mean, I have so many, but just talking specifically about technology and how people use it, is that it's very, very easy to stay within a kind of human narcissistic world through media and social media and the internet. That I see people sort of cathecting in the psychological sense, putting their energy into these kinds of virtual or technological information circuitry, this kind of mass cybernetic web of media and the transmission of human stories and human perceptions and human egos and identification and projection, and that whole game is so absorbing, so seductive, so fascinating, so enervating that it draws us away, or potentially draws us away, or draws some of us unity, which I think are not uniquely, but really to framework and really try to wrestle with the non-human, whether it's technological, whether it's geological, whether it's animals, whether it's capital flows, that we're really asked, we need to become better post-humans, not narcissistic post-humans seeking our pleasure buttons and figuring out the best way to design some kind of crazy experience, which is great, it's part of it, but we also have to work of trying to really think about what does it mean to live in a profoundly networked cosmos that necessarily draws us out of our narrow human egoic frame.
I totally agree. So I've got, in light of that, I'm really fascinated by what you might have to say on recent developments on the interspecies internet. Have you heard much about this? There was a TED Talk about it about a year or two ago.
I think I know what you mean. Why don't you set it up?
Okay, so you've got Vince Cerf, who is popularly, his epithet is the father of the internet. You've got Peter Gabriel, who has always been on the forefront of, technological creativity, and you've got a couple other people, dolphin researchers and bonobo researchers and technologists that came forward at a TED conference a couple of years ago to launch this idea that we can find ways to get into the sensorium of other animals and understand the way that they experience things well enough that we can create essentially computer interfaces for them that perform like a Babelfish Google Translate type thing, so that we're able to communicate, and whether it's through music or symbols or whatever, with some of these other animals that we know have a high intelligence and a sense of self. And I was really excited about being a part of this in some way, of just like throwing my bid into this process. And then I started thinking about how, it got more complex, because really what's going on here is that we can scarcely recognize a world beyond ourselves without immediately attempting to colonize it with our technological bid for control, and that there's something really beautiful about, to reference George Dvorsky of IO9 and his fascination with animal uplift, and this vision that he has, that we have an ethical responsibility to involve non-human species in the fate of the planet that is currently being decided by human parliamentary action. That the dolphins should get a vote, that the gorillas should get a vote. And the only way that they can get a vote is to involve them in the technological infrastructure that we're creating, that is allowing us the hope and the opportunity for that Star Trek world government. But at the same time, it's also enfolding them into our own personal and transpersonal nightmare that we've just discussed, which is that they may not want to participate in our especially and uniquely human breed of insanity.
Yeah, that's very well put. I mean, it's another, we keep, stumbling onto this Faustian bargain, and it increasingly seems in situations temperamentally. There's people who kind of believe that we can sort of design a good enough system where even despite its flaws, drawing in others to this decision the best thing to do, the most ethical thing to do. And at the same time, you can have people who are just like gagging in their throat. It's like after all of the violence we have exerted on the animal world, that to do this is like the final, most nihilistic violence, to draw them into this madness. And you could have the same discussion about the desire to colonize planets, and to, like, it's how could we not get excited about the idea of human beings on Mars, or even robots, landing on asteroids, and it's just totally fascinating and wonderful, and yet it's pretty easy to see what that would look like as an industry, and the kinds of problems that would arise, and the way in which human beings seem to carry with them this kind of you can be Christian about it, a kind of original sin, a kind of way of like always fighting and competing and outmaneuvering and exploiting and trying to create elites, and all this thing that civilization has been doing since the get-go, since we stepped outside of the Paleolithic life and made a pact with writing, and we made a pact with social organization, with pyramidical structures, and it's an old pact, and it's deeply religious. Our religion is fundamentally bound up with the mythology of the state. And so where I stumble now is where is the state? Is it everywhere? Is it nowhere? Are we at a point where that whole relationship is shifting? Is it worth extending hope into these things, or is it reasonable to say, look, we just keep doing the same thing over and over again? Getting back to the specific thing about animals, though, is I really buy that in a lot of ways. That what one of the turning to the outside, whether it's animals or indeed to elements of technology, but certainly to geological forces, to the forest, is part of what democracy means. And so what I think about it also, it's interesting, is how in in Ecuador, part of their constitution recognizes the rights of nature, not just nature, but Pachamama, who, as the neo-hippies listening to the thing know, people who are interested in medicine work, people who are interested in indigenous worldviews, that Pachamama is a goddess. It's a name for, it's a way of understanding and relating to the fecund, beneficent, givings quality of the earth in a whatever you want to call it, spiritual light, or a personhood light, or an animist light. And that's part of the Constitution. That's part of the legal document. And what some of the people who worked on that document say is that, look, it's extending the idea of rights, which is a modern construct. It emerges at a certain point in Western history. It gets installed into governmental and legal forms. Initially, it's just for white men with property. Then it's just for men. Then women get it. Then people of color, whatever. And you have the spreading of this notion of rights, and that we are called upon to spread it into nature as well. Very tricky, very complicated, very confusing. What does it mean? Who gets to speak for nature? And at the same time, to me, that seems like a very vital and significant mutation in the kind of operating system of neoliberalism, that you got to sort of factor in these others, even though exactly how that happens is so to understand. So, again, here we go, plunging into the Faustian bargain.
It's very much related to a book that I feel stands in a fun balance with yours. It just came out this last year by Christian Svagrel. It's called The Anthropocene, and if you haven't read it, I highly recommend the read. It's not. It really doesn't examine it very much ignores the mystical dimensions of things, but on the other hand, coming from this Schwagerl, lives in Berlin, and he's very much operating from a kind of secular European Union, modern global ecological sensibility. But the whole idea of his book is that, now that the last remaining wild places are, in a sense, artifacts because they only exist due to the determination of the human hand to preserve them, and that there is no real wilderness anymore on our planet, at least in the the natural world, that everything is indoors, that we have to find a way to first recognize that the so-called human age is actually tilting us into this much more deep and profound and complex and difficult relationship with the non-human world, but then also that we do, on some level, have to find a way to express that world in our own language and in our own systems, for example, by honoring what he calls ecosystem services in our economy, by not factoring out the way that the water cycle and the carbon cycle and all of these other things that support us have an order of magnitude greater economic value than anything that we're trading on the stock market, and that they must be preserved at literally at all costs. But he is ethically divided by the fact that he's like, but do we have to talk about the rainforest in terms of its monetary value in order to save it? Is that where we have to?
But that's the crux, That's the crux, and I'm glad you brought up this topic of wilderness, because I think it's a good way to show the problem, because on the one hand, what the wild represents, what it means to be wild, what it means to stumble across the wild in your life, the unknown, the mystery, a chaos, a kind of Dionysian encounter, an intensity that takes you beyond reason, whether it's experienced in a natural environment or in your head or in the city, that there is something about wildness that's profound to us, and that has a lot to do with what people seek when they're seekers, when they're religious, when they question the autonomy or imperial demands of reason. It's often in the name of some kind of wild, whether it's the sacred, whether it's the pre-human. And at the same time, you can sit down and you can go, well, but this whole idea of wilderness, for example, like just to talk about natural wilderness, well, it's a construct. It's part of the European imagination. They have the da-da-da-da, and that it's kind of over. It's not doing any good anymore. In fact, as very serious environmentalists, some will argue that it's actually in the way, and that the sort of religious and spiritual ideas about nature that were such an important part of the 20th century of politics, of creating the environmental movement, of creating the sort of sense of responsibility to not just animals, but to whole ecosystems, to the watershed, beyond their economic value, that those actually get in the way of this process of introducing these non-human factors into the system in a way that would actually force the system to recognize them and to negotiate with them as well, rather than pretending in this abstract, completely insidious, violent way that they don't exist, or that they are infinite in resource, or that you can just offload pollution, take it outside of the, that they're just externalities, as they put it inside of, economic theory. And it's, I don't know what to do with that. I don't know what to do with that tension. What it's meant for me is, I think it's incredibly vital in whatever way that we keep a portal open to the wild. In that sense, I'm very different than, I think, more rationalist people who think that, we just sort of introduce everything into the system. There's no more externality. Everything's inside. That whole model, that it has to be drawn into the logic of capital, it has to be commodified, it has to be seen. The way to deal with pollution is to create, carbon debt, and to sort of introduce it into the financial system. But the financial giddy house of cards. And so I think I have a slightly maybe darker view that whatever tumult lies ahead, whatever sorts of forms of chaos we confront, whether they're through a highly developed technological society that manages to keep it going, whether there are these major hiccups as society has to reorganize, breakdowns, weather events, whatever the thing is that the more that we are actually able to handle the wild, the chaos, the unknown, the mystery, the others, the whispers on the edge of our vision, the better we'll be able to actually navigate that situation on an individual and a cultural level. And that the problem with the rational, reasonable, incorporate everything into a sort of logic, squeeze everything for its monetary value, quantify everything, quantify the self, all of that is that it's all fine and well as long as it keeps a space open for those kinds of encounters, for that kind of imagination, for that kind of possibility. But that's often what doesn't happen. So, in a way, my work, not just in Technosis, but in all the work that I've done and continue to do, sort of riding these edges, is to keep those portals open, just to keep the spaces open so that people don't feel like they have to be fools in order to engage these broader, sometimes fantastic ways of seeing the world, because they end up coming around again and making a lot of, and with a good example, the idea that we can communicate with, that we can have some kind of empathetic relationship of heart requires a sense of imaginative possibility, that it's possible to actually communicate with dolphins. Or maybe I even think I do communicate with dolphins or communicate with cats. I've had experiences with animals that I cannot say were not communication. If I did, I would be lying to my own experience. That doesn't mean it's a fact. It's just it's my own anecdotal experience. But now we come around and we realize it's something like those attitudes towards animals and towards others is absolutely essential in order to be able to understand what we're doing on this planet. There's no way out of that farther bond. So that's why it's really important to keep the portals at the edges open.
Yeah, it's funny to hear people talk about the end of wilderness, because on that mundane level, it seems obviously true that we're suddenly forced to account and, to consider this world of externalities that we had, just totally ignored or avoided. But that at the same time, like you and I just spent most of this call discussing, this whole period is opening up a new kind of wilderness, that it's restoring to us this sort of pre-modern sensibility that we exist in this larger ecological framework. So at any rate, that's one of the many ways in which I feel that your work stands the test of time. Even though the sort of apocalyptic boundary dissolution that you critique in that book is now so much more complex in its manifestation and its implications. It's just as a parting note, I wanted to bring up one other book that was published in 1998 that I'm not sure if it stands the test of time quite as well as yours does, but have you ever read Cyber Grace by Jennifer Cobb? Say that?
Yes, I did. I thought that was a very interesting book, and there was a whole sort of period of thinking about technology, in the 90s that was willing to cover, theological or speculative vision, partly inspired by Teilhard de Chardin and the notion of the noosphere. And I think that those conversations are still have something to it's it's such a it's harder to see that larger that this is all part of a sort of unfolding beneficent plan. It looks a little bit more crazy than all. Book that you were resonating on?
Yeah, I think that the reason I bring it up now in sort of the final moment is just because the connection between your work and hers is that you were both aware of the the human imperfections of the technological paradigm, as like this, that essentially she recognized it as, a Tower of Babylon, but took this sort of the Hans Moravec approach that, these technologies are our children, and that we have a certain responsibility to them, and that sort of that larger that humility that we've discussed is the humility that there's this counter motion between, the humility of recognizing ourselves in the larger picture that we're discovering, and the humility of like having a child and having to care for it. And yet both of those are paradoxically profoundly empowering. And so I don't think that it's necessary that we throw away the naivete of that premillennial view. It is, however, necessary that we embed it in a much, more reasoned and seasoned adult sensibility that we're developing as we move into the actual like boots on the ground complexities of what it means to live in the world that we have created for ourselves. So I think your latest edition of the book does a really good job of addressing those issues, and your continued work to explore the complexities and the liminal spaces is an inspiration to me and a lot of other people. So.
Well, I really appreciate it. I just I got together a new website for this book. I'd been for a number of years as I was getting my PhD, which I'm almost done with. And so it's a real interesting time for me as well, because I feel like I'm kind of coming back out of a sort of academic. I was in the ivory tower for a number of years doing my own research, and back into a sort of large with the podcast Expanding Mind and other book projects that are coming up. And so it's a very exciting time, and I actually find it very encouraging that a lot of the things that I was into that again were pretty sort of subcultural or edgy are really part of the conversation. Animism or psychedelics or or apocalyptic fantasies, science fiction, all of those, the web work of intensely than be curious, wet path that I've been walking for such a long time seems to have some interesting ways of talking to our moment today. So I feel I'm very happy about the new and the way ahead. However.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to talk, and good luck with the release. All right, man. Take care.
Bye.